On the one hand, Inventum says that suffering is likely to be his objective basis for morality. See, I find this difficult when combined with ignoring the individual subjective nature of misery and suffering. I mean, people decide when they're suffering, and they'll tell you honestly, usually their biggest, the biggest element of their suffering. If they can't feed their kids, then they'll mention that. If they're really wealthy, they're Paris Hilton, maybe they'll mention their suffering is they can't find you know, they can't find a good blouse or something. And you might want to say, oh, well, that's objectively not suffering. But the point is, suffering is a subjective thing. To get a group idea, an idea of overall in culture that suffering is objectively wrong, requires acknowledging each individual event of suffering, as valid in some sense. Then you add all of those up. You take all of them, and that's your total body of objective suffering. And for example, Mendham likes to use, our preference for our own grandmothers, say, our own children. That this is a subjective bias that obviously can't be true. That kid is not objectively more valuable. Well, right. But the thing is, when I subjectively, prefer my grandmother, it's like I have her taken care of. It is good that somebody's caring about a grandmother. You're not supposed to objectively, care about my grandmother the same way I do. You're supposed to care about yours. And if you add up all of those relationships, yeah, you can too get an ethical system, because it's like, I don't want somebody to victimize my grandmother. And through empathy, through a relativity of perspectives, I can understand that somebody else is also concerned for their grandmother. And even without them, I can put myself, well, what if I was the grandchild of that person? A homeless old person in the street. Through my empathy of my grandmother, I can find empathy for that other person. If I'm just thinking objectively, then I'm going to wonder, well, do they deserve to be there and things like this? I'm not going to have that human compassion the same way. So, the subjective elements are what makes these overall, objective realities. Yeah, there's a lot of suffering in the world. Well, it comes down to individual suffering one at a time. And it does add up. That is, people that have been in a situation of a certain kind of suffering are the ones that generalize that suffering. I have a friend whose mother was in a concentration camp when she was a little girl, and she was a foreign national. Her father was a diplomat at the wrong time in the wrong country, and they had to escape. And she's a very, very nonviolent person now. Her experiences gave her compassion to anybody that might be going through that. Her subjective experiences, how come she got to a point of view that it's objectively wrong to treat people the way she was treated as a child. So this is kind of what Ian had said, that yeah, to get an objective version of a subjective thing like suffering, you need to ask all the people that are suffering, and they all get to put it in. If you want to say it's through an objective lens is how you're going to see it, then it's just a way of saying, that you're going to ignore some suffering. You're going to decide when people are suffering or not. And that's the scary totalitarian part of that idea.